The mystery surrounding Audie Murphy has finally been solved, and it's not good. Audie Murphy, the baby-faced soldier who had all by himself repelled a whole company of German soldiers who had killed 240 enemy combatants and earned every combat medal his nation could award, died at the age of 45 on May 28, 1971, when a small private plane crashed into the fog-shrouded Virginia mountains. Murphy was America's greatest war hero turned Hollywood star. We have been taught it was a horrible accident for 50 years. In the harsh Appalachian peaks, poor visibility, pilot mistake, and terrible weather are all minor aviation statistics. What if, however, everything we've been told has been a well-planned lie? Recent information has surfaced that raises ominous questions regarding Murphy's passing. There is evidence that the country he had given his life to protect may have purposefully silenced the soldier who had survived 27 months of the bloodiest fighting in World War II. The question of how Audie Murphy passed away is no longer the only one. It explains who issued the order and why he was slain. Rumors and whispers have come up from time to time in the years since that misty day in Virginia, but they have always been swiftly brushed aside as conspiracy theories. However, a troubling pattern has surfaced as classified records have gradually come to light, and witnesses have now spoken out after decades of silence. This pattern calls into question everything we believe to be true about America's most honored soldier and the nation he served with such distinction. Colonel James Stevenson, a veteran military intelligence officer, thinks what happened to Audie Murphy was more than just a tragedy. It was an affront to all that he stood for, and Americans need to know the truth. This is the tale of how America's greatest hero paid the ultimate price and turned into its most inconvenient whistleblower. However, the military services also hold it in high regard. He is movie icon Audie Murphy, a major in the U.S. Army Reserve and America's most decorated hero of World War II. From war legend to orphan, we must comprehend the man in order to appreciate the extent of this possible betrayal. A voyage from unspeakable poverty to unrivaled bravery. Sharecroppers in rural Hunt County, Texas, welcomed Audie Leon Murphy into the world in 1925. His early years were characterized by deprivation. He was the seventh of 12 children. When Audie was a young boy, his father left the family, leaving him to take on the role of head of the household. The 16-year-old Murphy was left to juggle what was left of his family after his mother passed away in 1941. Biographer Robert Williams reveals that he never had a childhood. Murphy had a deeper understanding of adversity and accountability from an early age than most individuals do. By the age of 8, he was hunting for food to feed his siblings. By the age of 10, he was working alongside adults to pick cotton in order to save pennies that would prevent his family from going hungry. A weaker soul may have been crushed by this grueling poverty, but Murphy developed a fortitude that would later help him in combat. In order to provide for his family, he hunted animals and taught himself to be a skilled marksman after quitting school in the 5th grade. For the benefit of others who depended on him, he had to learn to function with little sleep and to repress his own demands. According to Williams, Murphy's grueling early years were the foundation for everything that made him an exceptional soldier. The capacity to work under tremendous pressure, to put the purpose ahead of one's own comfort, and to bear adversity without complaining. The Army did not teach him these skills. He had been using them as survival skills all of his life. Everything changed after Pearl Harbor. Murphy was adamant about serving and tried to join the Army paratroopers, the Navy, and the Marines. They all rejected him because he was underweight, 112 lb, and too short, 5'N". In 1942, shortly after turning 17, he persuaded the Army infantry to accept him by fabricating his age. It's hard to believe what happened next. The most decorated combat soldier of World War II was this diminutive, illiterate farm lad from Texas. Over the course of 3 years, Murphy participated in 9 significant campaigns during World War II, progressing from private to second lieutenant on the battlefield. According to military historian Martin Dugard, he received 33 medals and honors during that period, killed nearly 240 enemy men, and suffered 3 wounds. His fighting history is a work of fiction. He used seized German machine guns to destroy an Italian cavalry battalion during the Allied invasion of Sicily. He turned a German machine gun nest against opposing soldiers in France after capturing it by himself, close to Ramatu. For more than an hour he remained in danger as he slipped into enemy territory to fire artillery at advancing infantry. It wasn't just courage that set Murphy apart from other courageous soldiers, says Frank Morgan, a military expert and combat veteran. While others were overcome by fear, Murphy's mind seemed to slow everything down, allowing him to make life-or-death decisions with remarkable clarity. His commanding officers described how he became more focused and precise in his actions when the situation deteriorated. His most remarkable moment occurred on January 26, 1945, near Holtz, France. When his company was reduced from 128 men to just 19, they were confronted by an overwhelming German force. Murphy, despite his injuries, climbed aboard a burning tank destroyer and used its machine gun to hold off an entire company of German infantry before leading a counterattack while injured in the leg. The 19-year-old Murphy later said with trademark understatement, "I don't remember how many Germans I killed or how many machine gun nests I knocked out. I was scared and I was fighting." Murphy was awarded the Medal of Honor for this action. As we now know, surviving the war would prove easier than surviving the peace. By the end of the war, Murphy had earned every U.S. combat decoration available at the time, in addition to 5 medals from France and Belgium. He returned home not only a hero, but a legend, his boyish face appearing on the cover of Life magazine as America's most decorated soldier. According to investigative journalist Michael Thorne, the nation that celebrated Murphy as a hero in 1945 would turn against him by 1971. However, he will always be known in the history of the United States Army as the most decorated soldier of world combat II, but in order to understand why, we must first comprehend what transpired in between for the combat hero to become a Hollywood star and then a menace. That would be none other than Audie Murphy. He was obviously out of his element when he arrived in Hollywood, but his journey there is a story that reads like a fairy tale. Actor James Cagney saw the cover of Murphy's Life magazine and invited him to Hollywood, despite the fact that he had no acting experience, because his status as a real war hero made him marketable, and Universal Studios signed him to a contract. Murphy lacked connections, education, and industry knowledge, but he had a genuineness on screen that audiences instantly identified with, particularly in westerns where his real-life experiences with horses and guns naturally translated to the genre. Murphy starred in over 40 films over the next 20 years. He wasn't just a novelty act, he became a real celebrity, especially in westerns like Night Passage, No Name on the Hill, and The Red Badge of Courage. His biggest hit was To Hell and Back, which was a 1955 movie based on his own autobiography, in which Murphy played himself. Jen says, "There's something profoundly meta about To Hell and Back. In one scene, Murphy had to recreate his famous stand on the burning tank destroyer, effectively reliving the most intense combat experience of his life for the cameras, setting a box office record for Universal that lasted until Jaws in 1975. The psychological toll must have been enormous. In addition to being an actor, Murphy was a successful businessman, a racehorse breeder, a country music songwriter including hits recorded by Dean Martin, Eddie Arnold, and Charlie Pride, a friend of Hollywood greats like Jimmy Stewart, and a straight shooter in an artifice-filled industry. According to clinical psychologist Dr. Matthew Sullivan, Audie Murphy suffered from what is now known as severe post-traumatic stress disorder, hiding beneath his picture-perfect exterior that gave the impression that he had transitioned smoothly from war hero to movie star. However, in the 1950s and 1960s, there was no diagnostic classification for combat trauma, and veterans like Murphy were expected to just move on. Instead, he struggled with violent mood swings, insomnia, and nightmares, and slept with a loaded pistol under his pillow. Murphy also developed an addiction to prescription sleeping pills and gambling. "I live in a nightmare," he once said to a reporter, "a real one when I sleep and a daylight one when I wake up. Dale Robertson, a fellow actor and close friend, subsequently noted that Audie never actually returned home after the war. There was always a part of him back there in the French forests, constantly on guard and in danger. In 1955, Murphy told a reporter, "Anyone who has been in as much combat as I have and says they don't have battle dreams, they're lying." Murphy's willingness to talk openly about his struggles set him apart from many suffering veterans, even though he could function in civilian life and even excel at times. Murphy was decades ahead of his time in recognizing combat trauma as a legitimate medical condition, not only because he refused to accept the prevailing attitude that psychological wounds were somehow less real than physical ones, but also because he pushed for better treatment of Korean War veterans suffering from similar symptoms and advocated for government studies of battle fatigue, Dr. Sullivan says. Murphy's personal life mirrored these struggles, as his first marriage to actress Wanda Hicks ended after just 2 years, with Hicks later exposing his emotional instability and that he had once held her at gunpoint during a nightmare. It challenged powerful institutional interests that preferred to minimize the true costs of war. According to Murphy biographer David Johnson, Murphy's second marriage to former airline stewardess Pamela Archer proved more stable and produced 2 sons, but it was still characterized by Murphy's inner turmoil. Pamela established a stable home environment that Audie had never experienced before, accepting his struggles and shielding him during the worst of the nightmares and flashbacks. By the late 1960s, Murphy had become more involved in veterans advocacy, frequently visiting VA hospitals, testifying before Congress about veterans' needs, and using his celebrity to raise awareness of the plight of those who had served in Korea and the growing conflict in Vietnam. Although their relationship wasn't perfect, she provided a haven that allowed him to function professionally despite his internal battles, according to Investigative. By 1970, Murphy's Hollywood career was waning, and he was hearing first-hand stories from inside the system from journalist Michael Thorne, stories that would eventually lead him to revelations that the powerful wished to keep concealed. Financial difficulties grew as investments failed. He had federal tax issues, and the decorated war hero was now fighting various battles and losing many of them. The financial pressures on Murphy in his final years have always been portrayed as simply bad luck or poor management, says financial investigator Rebecca Winters. Westerns were going out of style, and newer directors had little use for the straightforward heroism Murphy represented. The timing is suspicious, to say the least, but if you look more closely at the pattern, there is evidence that his tax problems worsened specifically as he became more vocal about veterans' issues. Murphy's life was also going on, something that has only recently come to light, something that might have contributed to his plane falling from the sky on a foggy Virginia mountainside the following year. What started as a fairly straightforward project evolved into something much more explosive as he uncovered disturbing patterns within the VA system. Thorne says Murphy started researching a television series about veterans' experiences in late 1970. By early 1971, Murphy was asking questions that made very powerful people very nervous. Then, as far as we can tell, yes, this is the plane that World War II hero Audie Murphy was on. The crash that never made sense. On May 28, 1971, Murphy boarded a twin-engine Aero Commander 680 at Martinsville, Virginia. They said they did confirm the number off the aircraft as a missing Aero Commander. He was traveling with 5 other people to a business meeting with investors when the pilot, Herman Butler, who had over 8,000 hours of flying experience, chose to take off despite the poor weather. According to aviation expert Richard Collins, Butler was no amateur, having flown in bad weather for a long time, and being known for his cautious approach to weather-related decisions. Given the circumstances and his familiarity with the mountainous terrain, his decision to fly that day has baffled aviation experts for decades. The plane never made it to its destination and crashed into Brush Mountain about 14 minutes after takeoff, instantly killing all 6 occupants. The official National Transportation Safety Board investigation determined that pilot error was the cause, citing Butler's decision to fly in unfavorable weather. It's striking how many leads weren't followed and how many questions weren't asked. The NTSB investigation was hurried by today's standards, according to former NTSB investigator Paul Martinez. Crucial forensic analyses that would have been routine were not carried out, and witness statements that deviated from the official narrative were either minimized or completely omitted. The flight path made no sense, says former FAA investigator Thomas Rawlings, and Butler was flying unusually low, much lower than standard safety protocols would dictate, especially in mountainous terrain. The question is why this wasn't a rookie pilot. From the start, some aspects of the crash investigation raised red flags among aviation experts and those who knew Murphy. Butler was flying below the minimum acceptable altitude for that location, which made his apparent disdain for basic navigation safety even more perplexing. Rawlings goes on. It's as if he was deliberately keeping the aircraft in the danger zone. Under normal conditions, this behavior is nearly unfathomable to a pilot with his level of experience. The state of the wreckage was more concerning. Before impact, a number of components seemed to have broken away from the aircraft, pieces that, in spite of thorough searches, were never found. The debris distribution pattern did not fit the pattern of a normal controlled fly into terrain mishap. According to aviation accident expert Rebecca Chen, some things that ought to have been present were absent. There were no critical control surfaces, which are normally present at a crash scene. Investigators at the time ascribed this to the impact's magnitude and challenging search circumstances. However, contemporary accident investigation methods point to a more alarming finding. Metallurgist for forensics Dr. Anomalies that were overlooked in the initial study were noted by Howard Klein, who examined photos of the recovered debris in 2019. Certain components exhibit stress patterns that are not compatible with impact damage. He clarifies, some of these patterns are typical of structural failures that occurred prior to the plane colliding with the mountain rather than as a result of the catastrophe. Then there were Butler's background discrepancies. Although portrayed as only Murphy's pilot, Butler had ties to government contractors and had flown missions for intelligence-related organizations before. His career history had gaps, including periods when his activities were not recorded in public records, according to his personnel records, which were partially declassified in 2015. There are several concerns about Butler's past. Sarah Jennings, a former state's intelligence analyst. He had flown secret missions in Southeast Asia in the mid-1960s and had ties to Air America, a CIA-owned airline. A normal private pilot would not have these qualifications. They recommend a person with certain abilities and contacts who might be useful for particular kinds of clandestine activities. The fact that the official investigation never fully included the witness reports was perhaps the most troubling. Before witnessing the plane fall, 3 different people claimed to have heard an explosion. In the final report, these stories were mentioned in passing but rejected since they were ascribed to the sound of impact rather than a mid-air incident. Harold Simmons, a 17-year-old local resident, insisted until his passing in 2018 that what he had heard had no bearing whatsoever. In a 2010 interview, he asserted that it was in the air before the jet crashed. I've heard that before. 5 or 6 seconds after the explosion, there was a crash. The sounds were different. Although Audie's widow, Pamela Murphy, had doubted the government's conclusions from the start, she lacked the means and power to do so. Pamela never thought it was an accident, their son Terry Murphy says. She would say, "Your father survived hundreds of combat missions. He wouldn't get on a plane with a pilot he didn't trust completely, and he wouldn't trust a pilot who would take unnecessary risks." These oddities remained, for decades, oddities in an otherwise simple accident investigation. Although Murphy's relatives occasionally voiced concerns, there was insufficient proof to refute the official account. Then everything changed in 2018. Investigative writer Michael Thorne says, a number of factors came together to cause what happened in 2018. First, under the 50-year rule, a large number of intelligence papers from the Vietnam era were declassified. Second, forensic technology advancements made it possible to reanalyze crash evidence. Third, when their life came to a conclusion, some who had been hesitant to speak for decades felt comfortable enough to do so. Even the most pessimistic onlookers would be shocked by the image that surfaced. Although the events lasted roughly 3 years, they felt much longer, I can guarantee you. Dark revelations and new evidence. Unexpectedly, the breakthrough was made. The declassification of hundreds of papers pertaining to Cold War-era domestic monitoring programs. These files contained hundreds of pages about Audie Murphy, a man who, after his military duty ended, should have been of little interest to intelligence services. The amount of surveillance is startling. According to historian and archivist Dr. Eleanor Whitfield, Murphy had been under constant surveillance since at least 1969. Numerous informants from his inner circle have provided reports. His mail was intercepted, and his phone conversations were taped. The monitoring was neither routine nor informal. According to internal papers, Murphy was designated as a priority subject under the FBI's now famous COINTEL program, a domestic counterintelligence program that targeted civil rights leaders, political dissidents, and anybody else thought to pose a threat to government interests. Samuel Drake, a former FBI agent and whistleblower, says the severity of the Murphy surveillance is especially unsettling. The resources used to keep an eye on him were comparable to those given to prominent anti-war activists and civil rights leaders. Why, therefore, would a Hollywood star and patriotic war hero be subject to such scrutiny? But why would the government be watching America's most decorated military hero? Few people were aware of Murphy's final endeavor, which seems to hold the key to the solution. Murphy had been working on a television show based on his experiences with the Veterans Administration in the months prior to his passing. He had discovered what he thought was proof of corruption, financial mismanagement, and possibly something far more serious throughout this investigation. According to investigative writer Michael Thorne, who has spent years assembling the details of Murphy's last months, Murphy had discovered a program that siphoned VA hospital funding for classified research. Partial records and conversations with Murphy's surviving associates suggest that he had found evidence of unapproved experiments on veterans, including psychological conditioning experiments that would subsequently be linked to programs such as MKUT. According to the records, Murphy had gathered a significant amount of proof of these activities by the beginning of 1971. He had spoken with veterans who felt they had been exposed to experimental treatments without their consent. He had identified specific VA facilities where dubious research was being conducted, and he had started tracking the movement of VA funds to front groups connected to intelligence agencies. Dr. Whitfield Murphy had made the connections between VA hospitals, defense contractors, and classified behavior modification programs. So this wasn't just about misappropriated funds, he says. He possessed names, dates, locations, and tangible proof that, if made public, could have exposed numerous secret programs. This finding would have been unacceptable for a guy who had devoted his post-war life to promoting care for veterans. Murphy also constituted an existential threat to the agencies involved in this study. According to Thorne, he wasn't just any celebrity who threatened to reveal misconduct by the government. He was Audie Murphy, the most decorated soldier in American history, and he was an unquestionable moral leader when it came to veterans affairs. People would pay attention if he shared what he had discovered with the world. According to the just-made public documents, Murphy had planned meetings with multiple reporters for June 1971 that he would never attend. His freshly examined appointment calendar, which was retrieved from his belongings, reveals scheduled encounters with reporters from the New York Times and the Washington Post in the weeks after his tragic trip. Thorne feels the timing is damning. Murphy passes away a few days before he is supposed to meet with some of the nation's most prominent investigative journalists. The Pentagon paper story would be revealed by these same newspapers a year later. In the public interest, they had shown that they were prepared to disseminate classified material. Records reveal that Murphy had spoken with his lawyer about creating a legal defense fund for VA system whistleblowers, which further adds to the questionable timing. Those who were afraid of reprisals but still wanted to come forward. Although it was not listed in the official inventory of recovered materials, the documentation for this foundation was discovered in his briefcase at the scene of the crash. The forensic reanalysis of crash photos and the scant physical evidence that had survived was the most damning of all. Through the use of contemporary enhancing techniques and analytical tools that were unavailable in 1971, independent investigators discovered what seems to be proof of aviation control system tampering. According to aviation forensics specialist James Michaels, there are tool marks on important parts that are not consistent with factory installation or routine maintenance. These indications imply that the control connections were altered in a way that would not be apparent during pre-flight inspection, but would result in catastrophic failure after the aircraft took off. In particular, the investigation showed what seems to be intentional deterioration of the elevator control cables, which are part of the system that gives pilots control over the pitch of the aircraft. In typical circumstances, the change would be invisible. However, the weaker parts would collapse and the plane would plunge into an unrecoverable abyss when it encountered turbulence, which is almost inevitable in the hilly terrain. Michaels observes that it's the ideal form of sabotage, essentially untraceable, certain to be lethal, and readily attributable to bad weather or pilot error. That's precisely the kind of approach that would have been part of the playbook for clandestine operations back then. A shocking remark was made by a former technician who had worked at the Martinsville airport in 2020. He said he saw two unidentified guys working on Murphy's jet the night before the deadly flight, but he spoke on condition of anonymity because of ongoing security concerns. Men who left no evidence of their labor and who didn't seem to be part of the normal maintenance staff. In a sworn affidavit, the technician said, "I didn't question them at the time because they had credentials. They weren't our usual mechanics though. My boss instructed me to forget I observed anything when I brought them up the following day after learning about the incident. I've had that knowledge for nearly half a century." Metallurgical examination of pieces from the elevator control system reveals stress associated with tampering rather than normal wear or manufacturing flaws, which lends more credence to the sabotage allegation. The particular pattern of metal fatigue points to the component's intentional scoring or partial cutting, a tactic that would guarantee failure under stress while giving the impression of a typical mechanical breakdown. The government itself provides the most alarming proof. In a written affidavit, a former intelligence officer in his 90s claimed that Murphy's death was not an accident, but rather the result of a containment operation that was approved at the highest levels after Murphy was identified as a top threat to key operations. Despite denying any personal role in the crash's mechanics, the operative, whose name is being kept under wraps owing to ongoing security concerns, claimed intimate knowledge of the operation. Trip logs that place known intelligence assets in the area of Martinsville in the days prior to Murphy's deadly trip support his testimony, which also matches details from partially redacted documents from that time period. Dr. Robert Garrison, a former CIA historian, says such activities were not unusual at the time. Many cases of domestic surveillance, harassment, and worse against Americans who were considered threats to national security interests were exposed during the 1975 Church Committee hearings. It is amazing that such techniques would be used against a person of Murphy's caliber, not that they ever existed. The internal documents on Murphy's death's aftermath are arguably the most disturbing. According to classified papers, a concerted effort was made to guarantee the crash investigation arrive at the planned conclusion of pilot error and reroute witness testimony that raised questions about other possible outcomes. When taken as a whole, these revelations paint a troubling picture. Audie Murphy, who had survived more than 2 years of brutal combat against Nazi Germany, may have been killed by his own government to prevent him from exposing unethical experimentation on the very veterans he had fought to protect. One partially redacted memo, dated June 3, 1971, less than a week after the crash, reads, "Issue resolved per operation, redacted, investigation proceeding as planned, with expected conclusions. All assets in place to manage any deviations from narrative." If that doesn't shake your faith in institutions, I don't know what would. Legacy shadowed by betrayal. Thorne concludes, it points to a deliberate, coordinated assassination of America's most decorated war hero because he refused to stay silent about what was being done to his fellow veterans. Murphy's family has found these revelations to be both devastating and vindicating. The idea that he simply died in an accident never sat right with our family, Terry Murphy, his son, said in a recent interview. spearheading the push for an official reinvestigation of his father's death. My father survived hundreds of combat situations where the odds were stacked against him. We now understand why. Terry has been searching for answers for the past 5 years, but he has encountered what he describes as systematic obstruction from various government agencies that continue to withhold important documents, citing national security concerns and increasingly questionable justification for events that occurred more than 50 years ago. He was silenced because he refused to remain silent about what was happening to his fellow veterans. It's like trying to solve a puzzle where someone keeps hiding the pieces. But we're not giving up, Terry says. Every time we get close to conclusive proof, another document turns out to be redacted, another witness dies, and another piece of evidence disappears. We will continue to stand up for what is right, just as my father did. In recent years, the Murphy family's cause has found unanticipated supporters, as veterans organizations from all political stripes have joined forces to demand openness, viewing Murphy's case as representative of a larger trend of government abuse and disregard for veterans. Even decades after his death, his story is forcing America to confront how it has treated those who sacrificed for this country. In 2022, a bipartisan group of senators called for the establishment of an independent commission to investigate Murphy's death and the programs he allegedly discovered. If someone like Murphy, the most decorated soldier in our history, could be silenced for speaking up, what chance did ordinary veterans have, says Vietnam veteran and advocate James Peterson. The opposition to a thorough investigation, however, speaks volumes, according to political analyst Dr. Margaret Chen. The simplest course of action, if this were a truly ludicrous conspiracy theory, would be full transparency. Make all the documents available, invite independent forensic analysis, and let the evidence do the talking. The ramifications go well beyond Murphy's particular case. If the accusations are accurate, they constitute a fundamental betrayal not only of Murphy but also of the values he fought for and the democratic institutions he thought he was defending in battle. The ongoing stonewalling implies that there are still secrets that powerful institutions don't want revealed even after 50 years. Military historian William Porter says, "There is a cruel irony here that cannot be overstated. Murphy repeatedly put his life in danger to protect America from fascism, against a regime that treated people like disposable objects rather than citizens with rights. If he was killed to stop him from exposing similar abuses by his own government, it is a betrayal so deep it is nearly incomprehensible." In the wake of these findings, historians are reassessing Murphy's reputation, having previously viewed him largely as a war hero who made a smooth transition to Hollywood, but now acknowledging that his dedication to veterans' welfare may have eventually cost him his life. Murphy never ceased fighting for his fellow soldiers. His battle simply moved from the front lines of Europe to the corridors of power in Washington, where he challenged systems that were failing those who had served. Historian Dr. Elena Rodriguez contends that we must view Murphy's advocacy work as an extension of his military service. The reevaluation includes Murphy's battles with PTSD, which now no longer seem like personal demons but rather the motivation behind his advocacy work. In that context, his death assumes an even more tragic dimension. He may have been killed, continuing the fight for principles he believed his country stood for. According to psychologist Dr. Matthew Sullivan, Murphy's personal trauma gave him a unique perspective, understanding the vulnerability that made them ideal subjects for classified research and the desperation that would lead veterans to submit to experimental treatments. His candor about his psychological wounds was revolutionary for its time and positioned him to identify and expose the exploitation of similarly vulnerable veterans. Previously viewed as merely compassionate, Murphy's work advocating for veterans with PTSD now appears preempt and potentially threatening to powerful interests who prefer that the full psychological cost of war remain hidden. His personal struggles gave him the empathy and moral clarity that made him such a threat to these programs. By being open about his own psychological wounds, Murphy was threatening a system that depended on silence. His outspoken criticism of how veterans were treated, once viewed as simply the concerns of a patriot, may have made him dangerous to those with secrets to protect, says veterans advocate Sarah Martinez. The ultimate tragedy is that Murphy, who had risked his life for his country on numerous occasions, may have been betrayed by that same country when he attempted to protect his fellow soldiers one last time. Murphy's candor about his personal struggles directly challenged the military and intelligence establishments of that era, which needed to maintain the fiction that real men weren't affected by combat experiences, and that psychological trauma was a sign of weakness rather than a normal human response to the horrors of war. According to Terry Murphy, sometimes the truth isn't just sad, it's sinister. My father deserved better. Better was due to all those veterans. One thing is becoming more and more obvious as investigations go on: America still has time to give them the truth, if not justice. For the orphan farm boy who became America's most decorated soldier, who overcame poverty and limited education to become a Hollywood star who battled his inner demons while advocating for others facing the same battles, the plane crash that killed Audie Murphy on May 28, 1971, was probably not the tragic accident we've been led to believe for more than 50 years. Rather, it may be considered one of the darkest chapters in American history. A chapter in which the nation's greatest hero became its most tragic victim. The greatest disservice we could do to Audie Murphy's memory is to turn away from the truth, however painful it may be, says historian William Porter. The final fight may have been for the truth itself, a fight that after 50 years he may finally be winning. Audie Murphy never turned away from danger in defense of what he believed was right. As more documents are declassified and more witnesses come forward, the mystery surrounding Murphy's death continues to clear, and what emerges is a tale of institutional betrayal as much as personal tragedy. We owe him the same courage now, the courage to confront our country's darkest actions and make sure they never happen again. The search for truth continues for Murphy's family, the veterans he fought with and later supported, and for all Americans who uphold the values of justice and openness. It serves as a warning about what can happen when power functions without accountability, even in a democracy. In life, Audie Murphy proved that one person of principle can make a difference against seemingly insurmountable odds. The quest celebrates not just Murphy's amazing heroism in combat, but also his arguably greater courage in standing up for others when doing so put everything on the line. In passing away, and in the pursuit of the truth regarding his cause of death,